If you have a question, send them in the chat to me. And when David takes questions, which will be at a few times during the talk, I'll take questions both from people in the room and for people who send me a note in the chat. I'm delighted today to introduce David Leonhardt. David, I think, as all of us know, is one of the nation's leading journalist columnists. His most important attribute, as far as I can tell, is that he's a Russell Sage Foundation trustee. But for his day job, he works for the New York Times, where he's the author of the column The Morning, which is a daily newsletter. It has what I think most of us would consider impressive readership. In addition to me, about 5 million others receive his column. David is an expert in bringing social science to the public on the most important topics of the times. Most recently, by his, I'd say, I'm not usually prone to hyperbole, but amazing coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic, in which he keeps up with the most recent science and social science. In a time of hyper-partisanship, I find his evidence-based reporting exactly what Russell Sage Foundation's interest in evidence is about. And I'm particularly reminded of his criticizing people who over worry about COVID risk, pointing out that other risks like being in an auto accident or drowning are actually larger than dying for COVID. I think because of this, he's been criticized by both the right and the left for coverage, his coverage of COVID. To quote a recent profile in New York Magazine, David, quote, has become the Times COVID conscience, a calm, clear voice amid a cacophony of competing and often contradictory medical, scientific, and public health messages. David joined the Times in 1999, when he must have been about 15.
And had hair.
He wrote for Business Week and the Washington Post before that. At the Times, he's had an impressive range of responsibilities. He was a business reporter, a business columnist, a staff writer for the magazine, the Washington bureau chief, and the founding editor of the Upshot section, which emphasizes data visualization and an analytic approach to the news. He also was co-host of the opinion podcast, The Argument. He's a baseball fan, I know, and he also wrote a book, Here's the Deal, How Washington Can Solve the Deficit and Spur Growth. In 2011, he was awarded a Pulitzer for commentary, quote, for his graceful penetration of America's complicated economic questions from the federal budget deficit to healthcare reform. He got his BS in mathematics at Yale, where he was editor-in-chief of the Yale Daily News. So today he's going to talk about how social scientists can influence the public debate. And I guess the simple answer is get David to read your work. With that, let me ask you to join me in welcoming David to Russell Sage.
Is it okay if I stand? Can people still see? Okay, great.
Thank you for having me, everyone. It's a huge treat for me to be here. I have relied so much on social scientists, including some of the people who are here virtually or physically in my work over the years. It's really one of the most joyful parts of my job to be able to dig into serious scholarship and learn from it myself, and then try to bring to a wider audience the same journey of intellectual discovery that I have had. And so I am very grateful to you all and to your colleagues. And so if I can give a little bit back by helping you do what you've already done for me, to other journalists, more importantly, to policymakers, to the general public, I'm really excited to do that. So I'm going to do a presentation today. It's broken into three parts, and I'm going to stop after each part and welcome feedback or questions or anything like that. And then at the end, I hope we'll have kind of an open conversation. And I really would particularly invite people who are online to submit questions to Sheldon. We'd love to hear from all of you as well. So the basic question that Sheldon asked me to answer today, you can see on the screen. Can social scientists influence the public debate? And I believe we have an hour and a half together, but to give you a spoiler alert, the answer to the question is yes, social scientists can influence the public debate. There is a very long history of social scientists doing so. I recently read Zachary Carter's delightful biography of John Maynard Keynes, which I recommend to all of you. And I think that's a great example of that happening at the highest level. We see it happening all the time, sometimes from work that Russell Sage has funded, in other ways as well. And so what I want to do is, before we get into the three basic ideas of how to do it, the tactics, I want to spend 1 second on the strategy. And I think this is the central strategy. It is not the only thing for you to do. You can also bring ideas that are not in the news and not in the discussion. But the single most valuable thing you can do is narrate the news. And the way I often think about this as a writer is when I am writing about something that readers are already thinking about, Ukraine, COVID, there'll be a few other things on that list. The bar to interesting them is vastly lower than when I want to say, hey, let me change the subject. And if you're not changing the subject, if you're instead talking about what they are already thinking about, you sort of have them at hello. They already want to know about it. And I would even go further to say the vast majority of people feel confused about the news, which is a little bit of an indictment of me and my profession, right? They feel like they don't quite understand some relatively basic things. And if you can help them understand some basic things, they hear that one thing causes another, right? The Federal Reserve causes interest rates to go up, but they don't actually know what is it the Federal Reserve did that caused this to happen, that caused that to happen, that caused their mortgage rate to go up. They don't understand it. Or they don't understand the politics of Ukraine, or they don't understand where some cities in Ukraine are. It's not because they are stupid, it's because people are busy, right? And I tend to think of my audience as being composed of smart people with almost no background knowledge. And I think that is often how you should think about the public audience for your social science. And you really have a lot of opportunity to help people understand what's going on. Again, it isn't the only thing. Sometimes there is such a big, fresh new piece of research that you're not just narrating the news. You're telling people a fundamentally new idea, and then you can connect it to the news later on. But this is the main idea, and it's an idea that I'm going to return to again and again as we talk today. I think this is a really nice example of narrating the news. Bob Wachter is the head of the medicine department at UCSF. And he writes, anybody who says, I hate Twitter, and I promise I'm going to have some pretty deep criticism of Twitter later today. Anybody who says, I hate Twitter has never tried to keep up with a pandemic in which crucial new data is released every few hours, data that often requires sophisticated interpretation by domain experts in areas ranging from virology to epidemiology to supply chain to sociology. And I think this is what Bob was saying, and I've talked to him about this. I asked his advice before today's seminar. What Bob was pointing out here, that he is an expert. in one field, not actually in any of these fields. He's not a virologist. He's what's called a hospitalist. But his point was he is often asked to help people understand what's going on with COVID. One of the only ways he's able to do it is to use Twitter, is to say, wait a second, this just happened. What are experts saying? How can I try to understand? And so this is basically the idea of narrating the news, that we have had a relatively large number of people who've been narrating what's going on in COVID in a way that is really quite helpful. Obviously, we now see the same thing going on with Ukraine. So I said the presentation is going to have 3 parts. Here they are. The first is talking with journalists and policymakers. The second is writing op-eds and other longer pieces. And the third is creating a presence on social media. I'm going to define social media a little bit broadly there to include newsletters. I don't doubt that there may be other tactics, and if you all think they're big ones that I'm missing, let's make sure we talk about that in the Q&A. So let's start with the first one. This is, and I actually don't know how to pronounce her last name. Is it Doliak? Is that how Jennifer pronounced it? Okay. This is a really nice point by Jennifer Doliak, who's an economist at Texas A&M. And so this was, you can go look up the entire string of this. It's quite old. It's from 2019. But Jason Furman, another person whose advice I asked about the seminar, reminded me of this Twitter thread. I think I saw it at the time. Jennifer writes, y'all, I know lots of people, mostly women, who are objectively a leading expert on a topic, but who won't talk to the press because they know they don't have all the answers. They worry they won't have a chance to make the caveats clear. She continues, I also know people who will talk about their very niche research area, the specific paper they wrote, but not any literature just outside of that, even though they're quite familiar with it and could communicate that knowledge to others. They might teach it to students all the time. And that's why I put the headline on the top of this first one, which is teach. All or nearly all of you are teachers, right? When you teach your classes, you don't limit those classes to the narrow area where you are most expert, where you are one of the leading scholars in the world. You also talk about many areas that are adjacent to that. You help the students understand this. And I would, if you are interested in engaging with journalists and with policymakers and others, and by no means do you have to be, but if you're here, I assume you're at least curious about it. If you are interested in that, I would really encourage you to think of yourself as a guide to them. They want to know about a broad array of subjects, not just the one that you are most expert in. And in the process of guiding them and explaining stuff to them, you can make clear to them that there are other people they should talk to about this stuff. You can cite the work of your colleagues and of people at other universities. You can give them papers to read. But they often don't have time to go through and talk to the #1 expert in 20 different areas, right? They're going to talk to fewer people. And if you look at this whole string, I actually think Jennifer has another tweet where she points out, if you don't talk to them, there is a very good chance they're going to end up talking to someone who's a lot less knowledgeable than you are. Right? And so I really would encourage you to think about these conversations as akin to teaching a lecture course or a relatively introductory seminar in which you are helping guide them through areas that may not be your #1 area. You're saying, look, the research basically says this about this, although there's some debate. You can read these papers, you can talk to this person. Why engage? This is a conversation with Jennifer, who kindly came in today for this. Another person I asked for advice before doing the seminar. Jennifer says, it's about promoting social science research rather than promoting my own work. I found this distinction helpful, especially since some academics are uncomfortable about doing the latter. We're not trained to do this, which I think is a really important point. It is a little bit unnatural to do this. I was just talking with a young journalist at the Times about some of the unnatural things in writing. That the natural thing is to do all your reporting and then basically just kind of write up your notes in some version. That's the natural thing. The unnatural thing is actually to step away from your reporting and think to yourself, what am I actually trying to tell readers? Just ignore your reporting for a minute, it's in your head. Think about what am I actually trying to convey to readers, and then come back to your reporting and use that to do it. That is a little bit unnatural for journalists. This, I get, is unnatural for you all, but it's vital if you want to do this. You can play an enormous service by talking about other people's work, by pointing people to it. I've had economists who I've come to rely on. I will call them even if there's an area that's relatively far afield from what they're doing, and I'll just say, can you tell me what I should read about this? Can you tell me who else I should talk to about this? That's an incredibly valuable role. So how to actually do this? My friend Kevin Cruz, who was one of the co-founders of The Upshot with me, likes to say human beings are here. And so I think that's a good idea here. Identify a few journalists whose work you respect. You don't have to know them. And I would say the same thing about people who are aides to members of Congress. You do not have to know them. But reach out to them. Send them an email, or if you're on Twitter, a direct message, or if you're old-fashioned, the phone, and give them some thoughts. Say, hey, I read that you wrote this article. If you thought it was terrible, it's probably a tricky thing to do. But if you thought it was a mix of good and could have been better, I think it's fine to do. Hey, I read your article. I thought it was really interesting. I thought you captured this nicely. I think there was one thing you didn't cover. And here's what it is. And you might be interested in this. Here's a paper, or I'm happy to talk with you, or you might want to talk to my colleague who does this area. There are jerks in the world, and some people will respond to that badly. They don't matter. The people who matter are the majority of people who will engage with it, who will say to you, oh, thank you, who will reach out to you. I have developed relationships with people specifically through that. When I wrote somewhat skeptically about the power of booster shots, because there was a real debate about how much immunity was waning, an expert in Israel reached out to me through a mutual friend and said, I think you got this wrong, and explained why. And I dug into it a little more. I talked to the people who were arguing very strongly that immunity wasn't waning. I talked to the people who thought immunity was waning. I looked at the data, more data came out. I decided that the person who reached out to me was right, and that I kind of had the balance slightly off, and that the more you dug into it, the argument of the people who argued that immunity was waning was a lot stronger and getting even stronger over time. And I shifted my coverage. And I don't know that I would have done that if he hadn't taken the time to reach out and say, in an incredibly respectful, substantive way, I think you got this wrong. And there are a lot of people, particularly in this era of nasty debate, who really will be extremely grateful for that. Other specific ideas. Basically, just kind of say yes and do stuff. Reach out, if you want to do this, reach out to the public affairs office at your university. They would love you to do this. Let David know here at Russell Sage that you want to do more of this. Just say, hey, when there's stuff going on, I'm interested in being part of it. I'm interested in helping people understand what's going on. I'm available. These offices get calls, particularly if it's something related to something in the news, right? If you have any expertise that relates to COVID, any expertise that relates to Ukraine, think about what's going to be the big stories over the next couple of years. Those aren't going to be the only ones. When you have an opportunity to appear on panels, do that. When policymakers and aides and journalists come to campus, go to the dinner with them, go to their talk and come up to them afterwards and provide that same kind of feedback. I mean, it's basically, it's just kind of basic human relationship stuff. Most of it won't lead to anything specific, but again, it's the stuff that works that matters, not the stuff that doesn't. As my wife likes to say to our single friends, it's not the bad dates that matter. Off the record and on background. You'll notice I didn't actually fill out this slide because I think it's sufficiently complex that I just wanted to talk it through. First of all, just to be a little bit mechanical and technical, these are really squishy phrases. These do not have solid meaning. So if you want to do this with a journalist, I'm not saying you need to have a legalistic conversation at the very beginning. And I actually think these are both very useful ways to communicate. I'll talk about that in a second. But just know that I consider the kind of technical definition of off the record to be very strict. It means I didn't hear it. It means I'm interviewing a governor and she gets a call that one of her kids is sick. And she turns to me and says, this is off the record. I didn't hear it. I'm not going to go try to find out from her aides that her kid's sick and then put it in the newspaper. It's like I never knew it. When the Obama White House would invite journalists in for meetings with top people in the administration, including sometimes the president, they would say these are off the record. And I was being a little bit sort of glib, but I would say to them, no, they're not. You are not inviting us in, just 12 of us journalists, to spend an hour with the president so we can forget that what he told us. You're inviting us in to influence coverage of the administration. So let's just, what do you actually mean by that, right? So if people use the phrase off the record, they don't actually usually mean what I think the technical definition is. On background is similarly vague. Many people use it to mean actually what people think off the record is, which is you can know this, but you can't in any way attribute it to me or anyone here. You can't use any quotes. Other people use it to mean you can use a quote, but you can't identify who the quote came from. So you all, for the most part, aren't going to be serving in government roles where these distinctions are super important. But I just wanted to spend a second on them, because if you're sitting there saying, what do these actually mean? You have a lot of company among people who have jobs like press secretary in the White House. There's just a lot of things. So what I would say about them is that many journalists kind of react somewhat negatively to the idea of talking on the record or off the record or on the record. Some don't, but it makes their job somewhat harder. Right? Because if they are calling you in order to get some sort of context or commentary or expertise, and you do the whole conversation not on the record, and then they're looking for quotes to put in, and they basically got to figure out at the end, well, wait a second, I don't actually have any quotes from that. I got to go back to the person. It kind of adds, it just adds complication for them. Having said that, I think it's enormously useful because it allows you to talk more freely without worrying that only one sentence of what you said is going to be what's going to appear publicly. And maybe that one sentence, while not wrong or inaccurate, doesn't convey the sort of your actual view about the whole. Maybe that sentence, as the British say, goes against the run of play. And so I do think it can be quite useful. What I do often is with people who I have developed sufficiently, I've been talking to for years. I will say at the outset, hey, let's just do this on background. And then if I want to use anything, I'll come back to you. But I don't tend to do that with someone with whom I have a new relationship because I'm not really sure what's going to come of it. What I would advise you all to do if you want to do this is say, hey, would you be comfortable if we spent part of this conversation on the record and part off? I also think it's fine to spend the whole conversation on the record, by the way. But if it's sensitive, hey, can we spend part of it on and part of it off? And because that will allow me to kind of speak a little bit more freely. And then let's spend a few minutes at the end on the record. And I'm happy to answer questions that you can use as quotations. Oh, and by the way, if you want to use something that I said on background on the record, just ask me, right? And I think if you want to do any kind of mix like that, depending how well you know the person, you may want to start with a little simpler thing is, hey, can we just do a mix of on background and on the record? And then if they say, can I come back to you with them, then you can say yes. I just want to say that sort of off the record on background stuff kind of has this bad reputation as it's somehow like a corrupt form of journalism. It is not a corrupt form of journalism. Like Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein don't break Watergate without off the record and on background. It's a really important part of journalism. And so I would just kind of encourage you to think about all those things. One final thing, if you do this kind of on background, but you can come back to me thing, please do not rewrite whatever quote you said in nice spoken English into memo English, right? One of the reasons we journalists use quotes is to vary the rhythm of the language in our article. We have to write more formally in written English. We are using your quotes to give the readers a break and to make it more conversational. So if something that you said on background isn't quite right, well then say no. But if you said it in some really nice colloquial conversational way and it's accurate, don't ask to change it into memo language. So that is the end of part one. So let me pause here, take a sip of water, and invite any questions or other comments.
just respectfully disagree, with this issue about off the record.
I like respectful disagreement.
You're coming from the point of view of the New York Times, a highly respectable newspaper. But many of us live in a world where the reporters aren't coming from New York Times. I'm in Minnesota, and so the people who talk to me don't have their degrees from university, and they don't necessarily adhere to the high standards that you seem to be describing. And so my advice to my junior college is nothing is off the record. Because particularly junior fellows, junior scholars, because all this time that you're investing in talking to the press is time that's not spent doing your research. And at some point, it's come back and bite you if it turns out that the quotation is something not quite what you anticipated because you said this is off the record.
Yeah. I think that's fair. I think both halves of that are, look, I think particularly junior colleagues need to think, do they even want to do this at all? Do they want to do any engagement with the public? Right? I understand that this is not stuff that's going to get people tenure. And so I can absolutely understand why junior colleagues might want to do it. I also think if you do not trust, look, if you don't trust the people you're interacting with, your ability to have a productive relationship with them is extremely constrained in any field of human endeavor. So if you don't trust the people on a basic level that you're dealing with, I might actually say, just don't talk to them. But if you're not sure whether to trust them, if you don't think they're that good, and you want to say, I am doing this only on the record, by all means, I think that's fine. Will you tell me who you are when you ask a question?
Hi, I'm Jennifer Glass. I'm from the University of Texas. One of the things that I wanted to note, I actually am the executive director of a small public research dissemination organization called the Council on Contemporary Families. And one of the things that we've learned is that it's really quite common now in tenure cases and promotion cases, so I'm kind of reacting to what you say, to have young scholars indicate when their findings have made it into the press. In fact, the last two promotion reviews that I did were filled. Every article after it was listed the places where the press covered it or where it was reprinted or whatever else. So I think that universities are really rapidly changing. They want this to happen. And people who, I understand, I have been misquoted, I understand Sam's point of view, and I do keep a list of people that I won't talk to again as a result of that. But I will say this, my university loves the fact that I get my university in national newspapers. And I don't know when that started and when that became a big deal, but it's definitely a big deal now.
I'd love to be wrong about that. Thank you.
I once talked to Breitbart before I knew who they were.
Does anybody have experience on PhD committees where they have seen this happening as well? Because I think it's happening pretty fast, but I don't know if it's happening outside my little valley.
One thing that I was gonna, so one time I had one experience, and I think there was, so this conversation about off the record and on background was very useful. And I think one time, I'm just basing my comment on an experience that I had. I think that there was I knew very little what the norms are in journalism. So basically I talked to a journalist and then I didn't hear anything. And I sort of checked back to kind of confirm if it was going to be published or not. Then just saw it published, never heard back. And I guess I expected some confirmation that the information was going to be used. And in the conversation, it was never clear if it was I'm going to use quotes from this or I'm just seeking general information. So I think that part also of some misunderstandings is that I don't know well what the norms are in journalism and how they vary from my context of academia. So I wonder if is it a standard, for instance, when you reach out to academics to say, okay, here are the expectations, here's how I'm going to use this information, or basically clarifying those things at the beginning.
So let me, sorry.
Yeah, no.
So let me first talk about the overall norms before I talk about me. The overall norms are on the record is the norm. If no one talks about it, it's on the record. Journalists do not have to come back to you once they have it and tell you they're going to use it. It's on the record, right? And I think that when they're seeking expert clarity, which is usually what they're doing when talking to you, I actually think there are good arguments for having a somewhat different situation. But I think it's important to remember that when they're covering companies or politicians or other people like that, it's really important that these norms exist, because our jobs would be miserable if we went and we interviewed a CEO who talked about what their company was doing and how the company was paying the workers or treating the workers. And then we had to go back and say, you said all these things, here's how we're going to use them. It would be a constant litigation in which all they would be doing is trying to make themselves look as good as possible. It just doesn't work at all. It is different when we're basically seeking your help in understanding something rather than covering what you are doing. Right? If you are the president of the university and we're writing an article about the university, that's more like the politician or the executive. It is different. And that's why I often try to make it a little bit more of a back and forth. You know, I'll say, hey, how do you want to talk? Right? On what basis do you want to talk? You know, and sometimes people say, oh, well, I just prefer doing it on the record. You know, to your point, people would actually rather just be on the record. Sometimes they say, can we do it on background? You know, and sometimes I'll develop relationships with people in which we'll actually do it on the record, but they know that I actually am going to email with them with what I'm going to use anyway, because I don't want to get it slightly mistaken. But I recognize also that I am coming from a very fortunate position here, right? My last name is of the New York Times. Not everybody, but many, many people will pick up the phone and talk to me. And for younger, less experienced journalists who don't have that platform, their job is often harder, and they are often, you know, writing on tight deadlines. And so I completely understand why they may not, you know, have the time to kind of do all that. So I would say, don't assume they're going to check back with you. Probably my basic advice would be, do it on the record. Start on the record. See how you feel about the person. And if you if in the course of that conversation you want to go to some place that's a little tricky and you're a little nervous about it, say, hey, this is a little bit sensitive. Can we go on background on this, which would mean you don't quote me at all on this or paraphrase me on it, but I just tell it and you can use it for your thing. And then, or you can just do completely on the record if you have a good experience with the person. Then the second time you say, hey, actually, can we do part of this on background? I want to explain to you some of the nuance here, but I don't really want to be quoted on that. So. No,
that clarifies a lot. I just had the whole experience felt very confusing. I was like, I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, no, norms are different in different.
Yeah. I had John. No. Okay, Kirsten.
Sorry, tell me who you are.
I'm Kirsten Swinth, historian from here in the city at Fordham University, working on contemporary America. I just have a question about when you need to say no. So let's say you get a specific request, you actually want to build a relationship with the journalist or the reporter, you want them to know you're available to them, but you need to say no either because of time sensitivities or, you know, whatever, they want to talk to you, you know, for whatever, generally a logistics reason, not a reason of expertise and stuff like that. What kind of strategies or tips would you have for keeping the relationship going while needing to say no in any given moment?
I guess I'll summon my friend Kevin Quayle again, and with the human beings or human advice. I would just say all that, basically. I would just say, hey, I really like talking to you. I really would like to be helpful to you on this. I just can't today because of this. Please try me again. And hey, you might want to try these other people. I don't know whether they're available. I haven't checked with them, but these are some of the experts you might also want to try. Basically, just still try to be helpful, convey all that. And if they react badly, again, you know, what can you do?
Yeah.
David, related to my comment about Breitbart, there's a question from the chat. What about worrying about gotcha journalists, you know, people who call up to, let's say, so-and-so is known as a promoter of a higher minimum wage, and somebody calls up and wants to use their research out of context.
Actually, I think that's an important point. Particularly, do you all know what Project Veritas is? If you don't, Google it. There are hucksters and liars out there. There are people who are not honest brokers. And so I do think if you get a call and it's not something, you know, I actually think it's worth being just a little bit paranoid. Not just because of Project Veritas, but, you know, other things, which is like, if you get a call from someone, you know, check where the email address is from. You know what I mean? Like, is it actually an email address from the Star Tribune? Or, no, if it's not, that doesn't mean that it's something bad. It might be just someone using their Gmail account, But I've had situations where I've gotten sometimes invitations to go do something from my Gmail address, and I've looked up the person's official email address, and I've responded to their official email address, right? Without even acknowledging that's what I was doing. So I do think it's worth being careful. And if you hear from someone that you haven't heard of, spend a couple minutes trying to figure out who this person is, because although the odds are small, they are not zero. That their goal is to make you or your institution look bad, right? And so I think that's yet another reason why maybe the best thing to do is start on the record until you've developed a relationship with someone and you have some trust. And then some of my advice on this is good once you actually have some confidence that this person is who they say they are and they're doing what they're doing. And I think it's always fine to decide you're not going to talk, and you don't have to be completely forthright about. You need to tell the truth, but not the whole truth. I'm sorry. I'm in the midst of stuff today, and I'm not able to do it. And you don't have to add, but I'd love to help you in the future, right?
This is sort of related to the idea of huckster journalism, except it's more mainstream. I've had experiences with journalists from the New York Times, in fact, I actually got a really good write-up in Breitbart, which really confused me. But things like COVID, I'm Arlene Geronimus, and I'm in public health. Thank you. Same here. Things like COVID, while the information's all evolving and it has gotten confused with certain political issues, you can do a version of what you said you did in terms of there's kind of data, and you really can make a judgment what's the weight of the evidence. But when you're talking about certain social issues, or your research, as mine is, relates to social issues, I've certainly had the experience where either because there was the attempt to have what they call balance, but they didn't really agree with what I was going to say, and they knew that before they talked. They had already decided. I might get a call to get so they could put in the article one little quote from me after they spent the whole article beating up on me and distorting everything about what I think. And that's happened to me, as I said, in major newspapers. So I'm wondering about this issue of balance. It's not always just hucksterism. I'm wondering how you think about when the social science researcher you're talking about is not talking about COVID, where there are certain objective numbers that everybody can agree are the best ones.
Are there with COVID?
Well, I would probably say no, but it's closer than a lot.
I think this is a really important point. I'm glad you brought it up because I should have included it and I didn't. I think that there is a whole category of areas where you are going to disagree with what people wrote, right? The same way I'm sure you disagree with some of the scholarship in your field. You think the conclusions that it comes to are not quite right. Not that they got the numbers wrong or they're doing anything dishonest, but you think it's less revelatory than potentially even misleading, right? There are debates. We live in a democracy. There should be debates. Sometimes these debates are really passionate because the stakes are high. They involve, the debate over healthcare coverage involves human lives, right? So of course the stakes are incredibly high. And I think it's important to think about this on a spectrum, right? There are hucksters, right, on one side of the spectrum. There are incompetent people. There are competent people who make bad mistakes, right? There are barely competent people who make too many bad mistakes, right? And then there are people who are legitimately competent in what they do, but who are going to write things that you have fundamental disagreements with. You are going to think that they put 80% of the weight on what you think is actually a small caveat, and 20% of the weight on what you think is the fundamental story. That is going to happen, right? It happens all the time. And I think that many of these questions, there's not a clear resolution, right? Charter schools are a great example, right? Like some people would argue, and I would say, I think I agree with this, that there is strong evidence that certain kinds of charter schools in urban settings have worked extremely well, better than the local public schools. Other people would say, I'm wrong for saying that, right? We can both point to social science done by very good people that supports it, right? And neither one of us is engaging in misinformation or disinformation by saying that. Neither one of us is lying. And I think one of the problems with our public debate right now is that the line between fundamental disagreement and sometimes intense disagreement, I think you got this wrong. And I think you're promoting misinformation, has gotten a little bit blurred. And so my advice would be, if you see someone who is arguing something that you think is fundamentally wrong, recognize that if you've seen their work before, right? You might not be able to catch it the first time because you don't know it before. And then make a call. Are you willing to engage with this person because you think it's important for their readers to hear your view, even if it's not going to be exactly as you want? Or are you not? I've dealt with that myself. I have, because of some of the things that I've written about COVID, some conservative media figures love to have me on, right? The New York Times is questioning how well some non-pharmaceutical interventions work. There are people I will not go on their show because I think they basically just tell lies. But there are other people who say all kinds of things that I think are misleading. And on some subjects, I do think are fundamentally false. But I will go on their show because I want their audience to hear my voice. I want them to hear, look, masks don't have a big effect, but they do have an effect. I want them to hear, you know what really has an effect? Vaccines. And I'm guessing a lot of people listening to the show are not vaccinated or boosted. And if you want to doubt how much not going out to eat has reduced COVID, I'm happy to have that conversation because I think that's a really interesting conversation. If you want to doubt whether vaccines work, I think you're fundamentally wrong. I understand the role that I'm playing in that, and I decide that it's worth engaging with. I also think it'd be completely reasonable for someone who had the same kind of views about these things as me to say, you know what, after I appear on that show, they're going to do wacky stuff about guns. I'm not going on. I think that'd be totally fine as well. And so my advice would basically be kind of make a call, go in with your eyes open about what it is. But also, I would urge you to distinguish in your own mind between fundamental disagreement where you think someone got something wrong, but that's part of living in a democracy, and engaging in something that is basically untruth or misinformation. Is that responsive to your question?
Yeah.
David, I think we should move on to part 2.
Okay. Writing op-eds and longer pieces. Okay. I could do a whole presentation on this. Journalists need to hear this as well. People I've worked with, journalists at the Times, have come to roll their eyes when they hear me talking about this because I talk about it so often, which I like, means they remember it. It's the one-sentence test. The vast majority of successful articles and article pitches can be summarized in a single sentence that conveys a clear, fresh idea and makes readers want to hear more sentences about that idea. One sentence with an idea. I will acknowledge that the word fresh here, it's fine to have a somewhat low bar for fresh, right? A truly fresh idea, like there are not a lot of those. But a fresh idea in terms of helping people understand the intersection between what you're talking about, that's sort of what I mean. Oh, I hadn't thought about that about Ukraine. I didn't know that. If I leave you with one idea as opposed to tactic today, it is this. The vast majority of article pitches that I have seen fail this test. It is true when I have talked to journalists who want to write articles. It is definitely true about op-ed pitches and op-eds that I have seen. I've never been in a job at the Times where I choose op-eds, but I've sometimes passed stuff along and I've talked to editors about what they see. The vast majority of pitches fail this test. They do not convey a clear idea. They instead tend to be nouns that are dressed up as ideas. So they say, I'm going to do, the formatting got off here, I apologize. They say, I'm going to do a deep dive into X. I'm going to explore the tensions around welfare reform. I'm going to give you an examination of charter schools. This is going to be a piece, and these journalists now love these things, how the stock market explains the economy. There is no information in that phrase, how the stock market explains the economy. None. How does the stock market explain the economy, right? If you answer that question, there might be some. Likewise, what A means about B, right? What Ukraine means about NATO. What does Ukraine mean about NATO, right? I get why this happens. Ideas are hard. Coming up with ideas that make sense to people who aren't already versed in an area is really hard. But you will save yourself a lot of time and headache if you rigorously ask yourself, am I giving people a noun or am I giving them an idea? And to be clear, in journalism, we do this all the time because it's easier. This took me about 15 seconds of Google, right? This is the New York Times, this is the Wall Street Journal, this is Bloomberg, this is Fox. You'll find it everywhere. Notice all this stuff. There are no ideas here. Maybe sort of you've heard this tells you that Brazil's had a surfing boom, so this might be close. Like Biden's free college plan, no idea. Pandemic surge, virtually no idea. Really no idea here, just none, right? This is the classic, what something means for something else. To which I would always say, well, what does it mean? Ask the question. So my advice on this is, don't be like us, be like Sue Dynarski. These are all headlines on actual Sue Dynarski pieces that have run in the New York Times. Every single one of them has an idea. I will confess I may have found a few Sue Dynarski pieces that were of the first category, but I didn't get them on. But Sue is so good at this. She is so good at this, right? There's an idea there. There's an idea there, and there, and there, and there, and I immediately want to hear more. This idea doesn't always have to be the headline. The world has changed in a way that actually it often is the headline. But this is not a headline writing style, right? If someone decides to put a different headline on the piece, or you don't want the idea to be in the headline, that's fine. Usually it should be. But I just would really encourage you when you're thinking about writing an op-ed, a book reviews are different. When you're thinking about writing an op-ed, when you're thinking about writing something from a general audience, ask yourself, what am I actually trying to tell people? I recognize that some ideas can't really fully be expressed in a single sentence. But most of them actually can start to be expressed in a single sentence. And that's why there's that other idea that is interesting enough that makes people want to hear more sentences. I'm not suggesting that that's the end of the story, right? In these pieces, this is not the end of the story by any means, right? Like, why? Why is this the case? What's going on here, right? How is that the case? But it's still an idea, right? It's not a deep dive into online courses during the pandemic. I'm happy to talk more about this when we open it up. Here's an idea that you might think is contradictory to the first one, but I don't think it is at all. Kevin Cruz, who's a historian, also kind enough to give me some time to offer advice about today's presentation. He says that people often get this idea that the fact of their study is new enough to be worth an op-ed. But my work is new, that's what's newsworthy. And Kevin says, well, no. And so I just want to remind people, narrate the news, right? This idea he's describing here that he thinks is wrong runs counter to narrate the news, right? It's instead trying to say, look over here. I acknowledge there are a small number of studies that are themselves worthy of an op-ed. But if you just assume that your colleague's study or yours is not worth an op-ed, that's a good place to start. It is also the case that usually you're not the best person to summarize your own study in an op-ed. It makes some editors a little bit nervous. It's generally better to write about multiple studies that are other people's and kind of weave them together. And it's fine bringing your research as well. Okay. So the question of where, once you come up with something you want to write, and my guess is during the Q&A, we may want to talk a little bit more about the how, right? And I'm happy to do that. Where do you get it? I think it's important to remember that while the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Atlantic have really nice platforms, and I would encourage you all to submit stuff there, and I think it's, particularly if you can develop relationships with people there, I'm all in favor of it. They are overwhelmed with submissions. It is not a rational process. I'm not going to claim it's a meritocratic process. It's a process. I would really remind you that the New York Times is not a monopoly. And this is a story, this is a Larry Summers book review of Piketty. If you look at this at the bottom, it is an 18-minute read. I can't remember all the details, but Larry was either assigned this book review by the Times or pitched them on this essay, one of the two, I can't remember. And was clear either when he submitted it or when he talked to them up front, he wanted to write a longer piece than the New York Times wanted to publish. And he then had to make a decision, do I write the New York Times book review of Piketty's book, or do I say, no thank you, and do I go to another outlet, which may lack the audience size of the New York Times, but will let me write, not unedited, but let me write at the length that I want to. Larry chose the latter course and was very glad that he did. He has told me that. He thought it was really the right call. He was able to write at the length that he wanted. And he said, frankly, I am not sure that I got any less feedback and interaction and influence from the people who I wanted to affect by writing in Democracy than I would have in the New York Times. And he just said, he didn't think it was a close call, that he thought he made the right move in this case. And I just think that's good to remember. Yes, I get that not all of us are former secretaries of the Treasury, right? So Larry has options that not everyone does. But I think there is a larger lesson here, which is, yes, by all means, if you have an opportunity to write an 800-word op-ed in the Washington Post or one of these other publications, do it, because it'll help you do it later. But there are also going to be times where you want to write something that doesn't really fit that format. And there really are a lot of other fantastic outlets out there, and they have different audiences and they can be effective in different ways. And there are people who are actively thinking about this question. Theta Scotchpole, I know, and her group think about it a lot. There are lots of different places. There's local journalism, there are other publications. I think Medium is also a really valuable place to write. This was an extremely influential piece that came out at the very beginning of the pandemic with the date on it, March 19th, 2020. It was about what we then called the coronavirus before we switched to calling it COVID more commonly, the hammer and the dance, talking about first you got to hammer the curve down and then you kind of dance up and down since then. The fact that it was on Medium in no way damaged its impact. You can get stuff out there on Medium. Medium obviously has some disadvantages. I would encourage you to have an editor, whoever it is. It can be a spouse. It can be a colleague. I'm sure there are people at your university who are available to you potentially as resources in public affairs offices or otherwise. But everyone needs an editor. And so make sure you find someone who's willing to edit you. But I think particularly Medium can be useful if you want to write something that you think has a shelf life and you don't have another outlet for it. So if you want to write a piece that explains, for example, why every month we misinterpret the jobs report, right? That's a piece that people might want to return to. You can link to it in social media posts. Other people can link to it. I think if you want to write something that you think has an enduring value, Medium can be particularly good because it can build an audience over time. Right? If you're talking about something that happened yesterday and people will be interested in it 3 days later, I think Medium's a little tricky because it's hard to build an audience organically.
So Russell Sage has a new Medium page, and if you're interested, talk to David.
Okay, questions about any of this? And I'll leave the screen on.
I have one question from the chat. Let me get it right. Can you talk about the distinction between social science and the physical biological science, where the public sometimes thinks that social science is common sense and things such as early childhood interventions, human capital, et cetera. So terms that people think are common sense and there's nothing new in them.
I want to make sure I understand the question. Is the idea that people think they already know about social science? I mean, there are a number of fields. It reminds me of somebody once said to me, somebody who sat in corporate board meetings, that they always felt terrible for the head of marketing because there was a lot of deference to the CFO when making a presentation in a board meeting and the head of R&D, but everyone thinks they're a marketing expert. So when the head of marketing made a presentation, all the board members basically beat her or him up. And there's sort of a similarity there. I mean, I actually think the challenge is bigger for physical and biological sciences. So it's true that they have more of a reputation as being pure science and being kind of reality and fact. It's also the case that many people don't see how that affects their daily lives, whereas people do see that things like pre-K affects their daily life. And I think for many people, if you can help in a relatively simple way, if you can help them understand how social science actually explains stuff that isn't completely intuitive, I think that can be helpful, right? There's sort of a reason that Freakonomics was a bestseller all those years ago, right? Which is in very quick, simple terms, people are able to say, oh, it wasn't quite the way it initially seemed, right? And so if you can find something in, say, about pre-K, in which, hey, people think this, but actually when we study it, we find that, I think that relatively quickly allows people to see the beauty of social science, that actually reality is more complicated than we sometimes think.
I'm Dan Hopkins from the University of Pennsylvania. Thanks for joining us. My question actually builds on that, in that I'm very curious, how do you build interest in and a market for evidence among journalists? So a year or so ago, I had an op-ed to write about the lessons from the Affordable Care Act that could shape legislation around climate change or other things. And the New York Times op-ed page told me basically like, we already know these ideas. And my point was, well, yes, in politics, there's not a new idea under the sun. The challenge is we don't have evidence for all these ideas. And more generally, one of the real challenges that I found is that enough political journalists and op-ed page editors and gatekeepers have enough of a sense of how politics works that it's very hard to say that what distinguishes my work or the work that I'm pitching or the ideas that I'm pitching is that they have solid evidence backing them. And so I was curious how you, and so typically we've done this through branding, right? I'm associated with the university and that university carries some weight, but particularly in fields where there's going to be some level of disagreement. And those disagreements are inherently political. To what extent was racism responsible for the election of Donald Trump in 2016? How would you recommend building a market for interest in high quality evidence when I have plenty of peers who are pitching alternative arguments that may not have the same evidentiary foundation, but there's also not novelty. What I can say is what's new here is I'm right.
Right.
The debate is over.
That's a really vexing issue, right? So I don't pretend to have the answer to that, but I would offer two thoughts that might be helpful. The first is, I think it's often helpful to go a little narrower, to come up with an idea that you can spend enough time explaining so clearly that people get it. And that when you're trying to cover a broad area, climate change, healthcare policy, it can often be difficult to have the time to explain why this evidence is persuasive. And the mere fact that people say this has evidence behind it often will not be persuasive to people. And frankly, it shouldn't be persuasive to people, right? Everyone thinks their ideas have evidence behind them. And so if you can go a little bit narrower, and if you can, instead of maybe saying, look, I'm going to cover 5 things, all of which have evidence behind them, and spend 3 paragraphs on each, cover one thing and spend 13 paragraphs on it. And then throw in a paragraph and say, by the way, these same ideas apply to boom, 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 right? And broaden briefly, but be specific. And the second idea, which is connected to that first idea, is I really do think logic is an underutilized tool in public communication. And so I would encourage you to think, not just saying, look, we know this is true because a study showed it, but walk people through the logic of why something that they might not be sure is true really is true. Walk people through the evidence, to use your words, using logic to explain it to them. And if you can get them to the point where you have explained to them so well that they can then turn around and explain it to their husband or to their friend, you have won them over, right? You have, it's not just you said to them, there's evidence for it. This is fact. This is reality. And I'm an expert, so believe me. It's you've gotten them to kind of get it in your own mind. Steve Pearlstein, who a longtime economics columnist at the Washington Post, who despite our different places of employ, very generously was a mentor to me, said to me that when you are able to explain to someone what is going on, you have a sneaky way of changing their opinion, right? And that idea is sort of related to it. And so with deep humility about whether that would actually work, what I just described, that is at least the approach I would take and try.
I think we can go on to part 3.
Okay. Creating a presence on social media. So let me return to Bob here, right? We've already read you this slide, but let's just acknowledge the obvious thing behind this, which is all these people who he's alluding to here had created a presence on social media, right? They didn't have to start a business to do it. They probably didn't need anybody's approval, right? They just did it. They went and they created a presence on social media. And in many cases, they had done it before anyone knew that we were going to be living through a, let's hope, once in a century pandemic, right? They were already there. And when the news happened, they were kind of waiting for it, right? And it can be extremely valuable. Here's Jennifer again. Here's another example of narrating the news. So this is, I just want to start with this idea of creating a social media presence by reminding you the most valuable thing you can do on social media, and there is no close second, is narrating the news, right? For the first time, the CDC asked teens whether they believed that they had ever been treated unfairly badly at school because of their race or ethnicity. Asian American students reported the highest levels of racist encounters, with 64% answering affirmatively. Jennifer, I assume this was like a brand new CDC study when you tweeted this, right? So the CDC comes out with a study. Did you know they were be doing a study like that? No, you had no idea. The CDC put out a study and Jennifer narrated the news. Super useful, right? It's not a new paper by her. She's just telling us how to think about stuff that's actually going on. Justin Wolfers had to get a University of Michigan person in for sure. Sue, that's right.
But she's most
trainer, yes. Yeah, at one point we joked that the upshot was basically the University of Michigan at the New York Times. Justin's great at this. The jobs report is a place. If you want to go see some examples of narrating the news, go online actually on Twitter at 9 a.m., 8:35 a.m. on a jobs report day. Tons of people do it. Although, as someone pointed out, do it when there's a Republican administration because the Democrats hire many of the people who do it best, and they can't tweet when they're in the White House. But you know, just like, so what time is actually, I didn't leave the timestamp on there, but you know, it's entirely possible that this was like 8:40. Justin read the jobs report and then tweeted this straight out. Incredibly helpful, right? For journalists who are trying to figure out. Justin even has a little snarky thing about journalists here, right? Like, which is fine. So I think this idea of there's stuff going on, I'm going to explain what's going on, is super useful. There are little tricks if you want to get people's attention for this. If it in any way relates to a story that you've read somewhere, let's imagine that there's something about wage growth in here, and Justin says, this is a continuation of wages growing, as Catherine Rampell documented in the Washington Post. You tag Catherine Rampell, she then sees it. She then thinks, oh, this is someone who writes about the jobs report, and doesn't. There are all kinds of little ways to do it.
So let me just, on this, because people are at different stages of their careers.
Yes.
So I'm just thinking that, you know, this isn't, I'm just using it as an example, but if I were a faculty member at an elite university, I would think, why isn't associate professor or assistant professor X writing their next article? Why are they wasting their time on Twitter? So, I mean, Justin can afford to do it.
Yep.
Jennifer can afford to do it. But at different stages of people's careers, it may not be, I mean,
Absolutely.
so there's just the trade-off between getting this visibility. I think an assistant professor, it's much better if you've talked to them about their research, and then in the morning column, you say, and here's an important, the way you quote people. So.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons why I want to walk through these three different tools is I don't think anyone necessarily wants to use all three tools in the toolbox, right? I did develop a relationship with Justin, an expert journalist relationship, before he had tenure, but I'm not sure he was doing this before he had tenure. So I think there are kind of different ways to do it. And I defer to you all about, maybe assistant professors just shouldn't do this at all. Here's Kevin Cruz again. A great way to cultivate a relationship with a journalist is through following them on social media and engaging with them truly engaging with them like a normal human being, not like an account blasting press releases and a book prospectus. Look at how Justin talks on Twitter. He sounds like a human being. Okay, this is my colleague Jamel Bowie. Now I want to get into some of the trickier parts of social media. I think it is absolutely fine, sensible, maybe even a good idea. You can be a full person on social media. If you decide you want to talk about things other than your expertise, if you want to talk about a sport that you follow, right? If you want to talk about the incredible UConn, who did UConn? I stayed up way too late watching it. Basketball game. Great. If you want to talk about food, as Jamel does, if you want to talk about all kinds of things, I think that makes you seem more human. And I think there are some real arguments in favor of doing that if you want to build an online persona, right? So I'm now about to say a whole bunch of stuff that I do not recommend doing on social media. This is sort of the preface, right? Which is I'm not saying you can't ever do this. There are ways in which it can be done well. I would encourage you to go look at Jamel's social media profile. It's kind of, it's a mix of like incredibly serious stuff and peanut butter, right? And like he even talks sometimes about how funny that feels. But I would be extremely mindful about what subjects you choose to discuss on social media. My personal advice would be don't talk about your kids. I don't even mean in detail. I think you should think very seriously before you acknowledge their existence on social media. Because people will say things about you. And so you have to decide, are you comfortable turning your child into a public figure? Obviously, many people are, right? You can't really run for office without doing that. There are academics who have done that very successfully because it makes them seem more like a normal person, and parents who are trying to figure stuff out can say, oh, that person's a parent too. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm saying think really hard about it, right? I have seen people tweet stuff about their relatives who have COVID, telling stories about it. And I would say two things about those Twitter threads. One, they're very useful for anyone who wants to think about how to deal with a positive COVID test. Two, read down in the comments, you'll see lots of nasty stuff about those folks' family members. So just think about whether you want to do it. Here's some friendly advice about thinking about what not to do on social media. I actually put this in an email. Nearly everyone I've quoted over the course of this presentation when I said I've asked them for advice. I sent this stuff to them in email and kind of asked them to fly spec. I would encourage you not to do repetitive political commentary. Like we have enough people out there doing that. Like you may have negative opinions about Donald Trump, or you may have really negative opinions about Donald Trump. Like the world has probably heard all those opinions. Right? I would really think long and hard before making some kind of joke, even if it's just kind of a little thing and you think it's harmless. You really don't want it to define you. The costs and the risks are vastly greater than the benefits. The benefits are roughly zero. I would encourage you not only not to harshly criticize others, but if you are responding in a substantive way to a critique, remember they are going to hear you as being harsher than you are. So when I engage with someone who's criticizing, I often will start by saying, thanks for that thoughtful point. And then I'll kind of respond, just to lower the temperature a little bit. Make clear, I'm not here to accuse you, attack you. I'm here to have kind of a thing. I've already covered the family thing. And I would really encourage you to separate your enjoyment of an alcoholic beverage with your social media. I would remind you that I encourage you, if you write for media, to get an editor. You're not going to get an editor for social media. There's going to be no one over your shoulder in all likelihood. You are your editor. Separate those two people. Write a tweet, look at it, and think, how would I feel about this if I were the editor of this? I think it's also important to take a couple minutes talking about the reality of what you're going to find if you do decide to build a social media account. There is no avoiding this. So I have praised Justin, I have praised Jennifer, I've praised Kevin Cruz of having good social media profiles. There is no, I'm going to have a social media profile and I'm going to avoid this kind of harsh criticism. That's not one of your options. As Jennifer says, with public engagement comes criticism, lots of it, and often in ugly forms. As an Asian American woman, when someone disagrees with me, the backlash can quickly turn misogynistic and racist, including from other Asian Americans. Other women of color have reported the same. So not only is not getting the abuse is not one of your options. You will get forms of it that are worse if you are a person of color or you are. I think that I don't have any advice about whether it's worth it. I think it's completely reasonable to decide it is not worth it at all. I also think it's reasonable to decide I want to engage. Just do it with your eyes open. If you have any doubt about this, this is a well-known. I'm not going to post any of the horrible things. I would say it is not limited also. It is worst for women and people of color. It is not limited to any one group. I have had, Sheldon, I appreciate your kind words about it. Not everyone agrees with Sheldon's interpretation of my COVID coverage. I have had a real increase in the volume of incredibly nasty things that people have said about me online over the last few months. I've been called a eugenicist. I've had people use violent imagery in tweets for me. Sometimes the people doing this are professors, right? I'm not just talking about random people who have only 4 followings on Twitter. This is the world that we now live in, and you have to really think about whether this is worth it for you. I have decided it is worth it for me. I have the New York Times behind me strongly. It is an institution that believes in speech, right? One of our mottos is without fear or favor. I have checked in with my bosses. They have said to me, is there anything more we can do to defend you? And I've said, I'm fine. I was very fortunate that I worked for this hothouse high school newspaper where we were doing things like advocating for my high school to divest from South Africa and saying that the school wasn't doing enough to deal with racism and sexism. And I had a calculus teacher whom I adored and respected and who was deeply small c conservative. And she used to stand in front of our calculus class on Fridays with the newspaper coming out and tell us all the things we got wrong in the newspaper. And I have deep respect for her. And my attitude is no one on Twitter can harm me more than my calculus teacher. And if I can survive that, I can survive any of this stuff. But I recognize that many of you are not in the same situation that I am, right? You didn't sign up for this as part of what you do. And I want to try to be really clear-eyed about just how nasty this stuff is. If you think it's going to make you completely miserable, you really should think about whether to do it. There are other options besides social media. As Emily Oster, another person who gave me advice about this, says the algorithm values outrage. It's a feature, not a bug, as they say, right? The outrage is part of what's going on. Emily recently quit Twitter. You can see here, back in February, she said, I'm leaving active engagement on Twitter. This will be my last set of tweets for the foreseeable future. Although I see a lot of value in information sharing here, I think the recent period has been marked by largely unproductive dialogue, at least around COVID. There is a need for real policy debate, engagement with what we know and do not know, but this just isn't happening here. Also, although the pandemic has thickened my skin quite a bit, 18 months has taken a toll. Right? I'm going to talk in a minute about what Emily decided to do instead. But I want to talk about a second group of people, in addition to women of color, in addition to women and people of color, who for whom Twitter is particularly tricky right now. Emily happens to be in both categories. And that is anyone who's going to say things that, broadly speaking, the progressive left is going to object to. Twitter is not a random assortment of Americans. It skews very heavily toward a few groups. It skews white. Okay, so here you're looking at who is on social media, okay? And I'm gonna go back and forth between real life. These are Democrats, okay? So watch, this is real life, right? White, college educated, this is basically left to right. This is left, that's right. This is race and education. The sample size is not big enough to split Black and Hispanic other into the education groups. That's why it appears this way. So look how much bigger these circles get up here. Who is on social media? It tends to be people who are to the left, who are more educated, who are more white. Who was less likely to be on social media? It tends to be people who are working class, people who are Black, people who are Hispanic. Happy to put these slides back up if anyone wants to look at them. What this means is that if you are going to make arguments on social media, particularly given the worlds that you all are in, which is universities and academia, and your arguments are going to run counter to what is the prevailing opinion on the progressive left, expect extra criticism and even abuse. That is what Emily ran into. Emily argued, I would argue Emily's position is actually more progressive, but I don't get to decide what it is. Emily argued that we need to worry about the damage to children, and particularly low-income children, and particularly children of color, by closing schools. This was come to be seen as a conservative argument, right? And Emily might be right, Emily might be wrong, I might be right, I might be wrong. I would argue that it is certainly a reasonable argument to be had, right? But if you make on any set of issues arguments that are going to be deeply opposed by the folks who are in this bubble, expect an extra degree of harshness on Twitter. That is who is on Twitter. The most famous example of this is David Shore, a Democratic strategist, who in May 2020, during the Black Lives Matter protest, tweeted a study by Omar Wasso looking at the fact that in 1968, areas where there were violent riots had the Democratic vote share go down, Nixon did better. Area where there was nonviolent protests had the Democratic vote share go up. This tweet got him fired. You can read the whole history of it. It got him fired. He continues to work quite successfully in Democratic politics, but the place where he works will not acknowledge that he works for them. Again, disagree with this tweet or agree with it. It strikes me as it is deeply illiberal if this leads to someone being fired. And I just think it's important to go in again with your eyes open about that. Emily decided it wasn't worth it anymore. And so where did she go? Well, Twitter's not a monopoly. So there are all kinds of options. I'm not your best expert on how to engage with Facebook and Instagram. I don't really use them. I have no doubt that there are good ways to do so. And I think if you wanted to do so, I would encourage you to explore. I would also encourage you to keep your eye out for what's next. In 30 years, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram are not going to be the big social media platforms. If something starts, just go there and start. When you do that and you get it right, you can end up with an incredible following. That's how my former colleague, Nick Kristof, ended up with like millions of Twitter followers. But when Twitter was nothing and they were excited to have Nick Kristof, he went eagerly there. And as a result, he kind of rode the escalator up. And then finally, because I want to leave time for questions or disagreement, particularly on some of this political stuff, I think newsletters can be really interesting. Now, obviously, if you start a newsletter, it's not if you build it, they will come, right? So you got to think about how do you build an audience. But this newsletter by Caitlin, I just highly recommend for anyone who wants to think about COVID. It's called Your Local Epidemiologist. It's really quite lovely. I think starting a newsletter is an interesting idea. I think if you did it, you might want to think about, at least at first, mixing it with social media. Right? So that social media can be a way for people to find out about the newsletter. You tweet out the newsletter so people then go follow a link, then they subscribe. If you start, I would argue, start free, make it free for everyone. You can turn up the heat on the boiling water on whatever is the animal that you're supposed to put in the family, right? That's fine. Or you don't ever have to, right? Like most of you have jobs, and part of your job is to engage with the public, and so I think you can decide to leave it completely free. I think the people who have had the most successful newsletters are doing something that will allow me to end where I started. What does Caitlin do? She is narrating the news. That is really highly useful. So that's the end of the presentation, and we've both got discussion of this third part and also anything from earlier or anything I didn't cover. And I just want to emphasize that if I said anything you disagree with, I welcome disagreement. I'm a liberal, despite what you may have heard.
I've got 2 comments on the chat I'll ask, but let me go around the room. Sir, I see Serena. And John? Okay, but I'm going to do the ones from online first. Can you talk about how a journalist takes stock of the literature, like your process of adjusting your opinion on boosters? It seems that the process failed. It required the direct intervention of somebody to correct the mistake. There's a tendency in the news to seek out both sides, which has the effect of elevating less accepted work simply because there needs to be an opposing side with not enough context or weight given to which side is actually right.
I think there are 2 different questions there. I actually think the process did work. I think the evidence was changing on boosters. And I think I'm not defending where I've been on it, but there was a real debate on it. I mean, there were highly credentialed people who I think are very smart who are arguing that immunity is not waning in any meaningful way. And I didn't have the expertise when the evidence was still emerging to decide which group was right and which group was wrong. I tried to use logic. There was no way to resolve it just by saying, what do the experts say? The experts were saying diametrically opposed things. And so I kind of wrote that. And over time, the evidence began to change. And I listened more fully to the arguments that people were making and tried to use logic, and ultimately decided that one side had a better case than another. I think someone who had done it more effectively than I did it would have gotten there a little bit earlier than I did. So I think my approach was imperfect, but I think the process worked. And I think it's completely fine, the idea that we're not always going to know exactly what reality is, and journalists are going to have to kind of shape that and correct it over time.
So let me tie this into the question about social science, because that was a question about science. I'm reminded that my good friend Jason DeParle, whose work I love,
Me too.
recently had an article in which he quoted a right-wing loon, which when I was young, it used to be you had to quote Robert Rector from Heritage every year when the poverty report came out,
Right.
and Jason would do it. And that's that. So that's in this is social science, and the poverty numbers come out once a year. And the report, Jason and the other reporters would call academics who actually did research, and they'd say something, but then they'd say, and of course, Robert Rector says, no, welfare people are just lazy bums. And that would get into every story. So I think that's
I'm deeply sympathetic to the criticism of both sides. I think it's been one of the most important things that the political left has done to ask journalists to do a better job. I think it's true on climate change. I think it's true on any number of subjects, right? I think it's true on some of these democracy issues. Both sides do not equally use sort of hardball, right, as the political scientists call it. And I think the way we cover these things often is still flawed, but I think it's better than it used to be. And so I would say that I think the criticism of both sides is important, and please keep it coming at us. We need to hear it. I would also ask people to remember that when many people criticize both sidesism, they expand that beyond the category of things where I think actually there's a clear answer to include areas where they happen to have an opinion about something, right? I know there are people out there who would say it's both sidesism to cover charter schools in a certain way, a subject I alluded to before. I don't think it is, right? If anything, I think sometimes we do both sidesism in the other direction. And so I would just remind people that there are not easy answers on these things. And what you consider what I consider both sidesism, someone who is smart and expert and knowledgeable might actually consider to be putting the weight of the evidence where it deserves to be. And on many of these questions, it's really hard to know, right? Like do any of you know Paul Saban's book, The Bet, right? About whether overpopulation was going to be a huge problem in the United States in the 60s and 70s. Like, well, in the end, one side won that bet, right? And I'm deliberately picking something where I think the more conservative view won out, because there's a longer list of things where the more liberal view won out. Because liberals have been right about a lot more than conservatives over the last 30 years, I would argue. But like, was it both? What if someone had said, I actually think overpopulation is a huge problem, and acknowledging the possibility that it's not is both sidesism, and so I'm going to ignore that view. Well, that view was right in the end, right? Julian Simon was right in the end. And so I just would encourage, while both inviting the criticism on both sidesism, I would ask people to have some humility about how many things are actually settled.
I have one more question. Advice regarding social media on topics that are highly politicized, like immigration.
I mean, it's a cousin of what I said earlier, right? So let's go back to this, right? Many working class people in the United States, not just working class people, many working class people in the United States, including people of color, are in favor of relatively strict immigration enforcement and relatively strict immigration restrictions, right? That is not some ridiculous outside the mainstream view. If you wanted to go argue that on Twitter, I would encourage you to think long and hard and have a completely clear sense of what you were going to get into if you did that. I'm not saying that that view that many people in the United States have is necessarily right? But it's a legitimate debate. And I think if you wanted to go on Twitter and argue for stricter immigration enforcement, I've looked at the polling data, right? That's a view many Americans across races polled. If you want to argue that on Twitter, I would just do it, having a very clear sense of exactly what that debate was going to be like and what you were going to be accused of. I'm not sure Twitter's the best place to have that. Sarita?
Hi, thank you. My name is Sarita Amrute. I'm an anthropologist. I work on race, caste, and digital technology. I have two big questions, so it's okay if you don't have bandwidth to answer them, but I just wanted to put them on the table. I really was appreciative when you turned to the specific harms and risks that women and women of color face in the Twitterverse. But I was wondering if you could imagine for us what the first two parts of your presentation would look like and sound like if you were also taking into consideration what women and especially women of color need to think about when they're thinking about narrating the news, writing op-eds, being quoted in pieces. So that's my first really big question. My second big question is precisely about the risks on social media. And I'm sort of asking a little bit for your opinion, but also for your opinion in your profession as a journalist. I'm very curious about the blue check mark and verifications, because there are ways that we could get our ideas out there anonymously. So the technical affordances of social media would allow us, if we wanted, to put our ideas out anonymously. But if you understand all of these places, these platforms as, in fact, media producers, then verification and the association of an idea with a name that's verified is very important to making those stories credible, or making the media move, having more followers, circulate, become viral, and all of that. So I'm wondering how you think about that conundrum or problem, because if our point is to present an idea, then in fact social media does allow us to do it. But if the point is to present an idea that's associated with our name, our person, and our expertise associated with particular institutions, then it really ramps up the amount of risk that we are facing.
Those are two big questions. Thank you. Maybe I'm not sure I have anything to say about the second, but I want to think about it a little bit. I think it's hard for me to imagine a world in which much of the public debate happens anonymously.
Or collectively?
or collectively. That's interesting. Maybe that is, where groups of people come together and we say, I would say that would involve a lot of time for those groups of people, right? Meaning you'd have to spend a lot of time kind of hammering out what you were all comfortable with saying before you put it out there. So I would sort of defer to you all. Is that something that academic research would be willing to do, to basically turn over a lot of their time to negotiating statements among themselves before putting it out there? I don't know. But I want to talk, or at least ask a little bit about your first question, which is, I guess I'd be curious, which of the ideas that I presented do you think are sort of off or incomplete in terms of narrating the news for women of color?
I don't know if they're off or incomplete. I'm really asking an open-ended empirical question, or maybe a thought experiment. So just some things that sparked for me. One, many of us work on issues that don't become newsworthy in the same way that let's say the war in Ukraine. There is a gender dimension to that story, of course. There's a racialized dimension as well. But sometimes we're working on these long-term, slow-moving structural problems that affect our communities in particular, and it's sometimes not as easy to use that frame of narrating the news. Other times when I talk to journalists, sometimes it's hard to explain a particular risk around how I speak about caste. For instance, for me, it would be extremely dangerous to ever mention the Prime Minister of India by name. That is a clear way that I've learned over time that people become targeted in serious ways. So there's just a lot more explaining sometimes you have to do.
Yeah.
Another way might be just, the historical whiteness of the institutions that we're engaging with, either the university or the newsroom. They're both historically very, very white places. I hope I'm not insulting you right now. And so we maybe don't have those same abilities to build out the relationships that you're talking about. I mean, it would be hard for me to go through each one without.
Yeah, no, I think, so I think there are a few different things there. I think that, let me just mention two briefly. I think your point about studying stuff that is not Ukraine or COVID, I think is a really important point, because that is most subjects. Right? It actually reminds me of a great line. When I was in college, Anna Quinlan, who was then a New York Times op-ed columnist whom I idolized, said, and basically the New York Times op-ed columnists were like a bunch of white men who wrote about politics. And she said, people will say to me, is it hard for you to be off in this small little area? And she said, oh, no, it's all the other people who are off in a small little area. I get the rest of the world, right? And so I think there's a way in which that's actually true about COVID and Ukraine, right? And so for people who are writing about poverty, for people who are writing about inequality, for people who are writing about climate change, there's a whole, those are not these things. Many of the issues that you all study do have a connection to something in the news, right? So it's expiring stuff in Build Back Better. Right? It's something that's going on in the job market, right? It's another piece of legislation that's out there. And so what you basically want to look for are opportunities to turn what is your expertise in one area into narrating the news, right? This is going on out there, and one better way to understand it is actually to understand this whole big backstory. It needs to have a real connection. So I don't doubt that there are some areas for which it would be very difficult. But I think that is one way to do it. It is, you are stating a fact by saying many of these institutions are historically very white and very male. That is a fact. I've now worked at the New York Times for 23 years, and I have gone from in some of my positions in management and I want to say that I did this imperfectly and should have been even more aggressive than I was, for being an advocate for we need to diversify this newsroom in ways, and feeling like it just wasn't happening. Everyone's heart was in the right place, and people were not getting it done, or their right seat was being in the right place. And it was not getting done. That has changed. It is still not perfect, but the extent to which our staff has diversified over just the past few years is striking. The extent to which our outside contributors have diversified is striking. I am not saying that we're in the right place. We're not. But there is real movement and interest inside these places. And so that doesn't make the barriers and the walls go away, but it does mean that there is a more welcoming desire than there used to be. And if there are ways in which people want to get institutions like the Times to engage and say, hey, you know what? All of the people you have writing about this subject have been men or have been white people. That is something, and I'm happy to reach out to me. I'm happy to convey that message to folks. There is an openness to do better that is fundamentally new. And I think you see that actually with narrating the news. If you look at the people who are on TV talking about COVID, they are far more diverse, that group of people, than COVID researchers as a whole are, which again is not saying we're in the right place, but there are opportunities to force these institutions right now to do better than they were doing.
All right, I'm going to thank David. We've run over. John has a question, but I'll let him ask after we let everybody adjourn. Thanks to the people online. And again, thanks, David.
Thank you all for having me.